Thank you very much, Christopher, for, I think, a very flattering resume. I didn't know that I had such a very fascinating personality until you actually went all on it. I want to thank everyone for coming, and of course, to give me this opportunity to share my research with you. And also, I think it is a moment in which I'll be able to develop it, because this is very much work in progress. So I'm a visiting Humboldt fellow, and when I came here in December, actually, it was at the height of winter, and it felt like political exile. But then summer came, and then I felt like I was on holiday. And one of the things that I really love doing in Regensburg, of course, is just interacting with landscapes, because I believe that landscapes, in certain ways, actually, they embody histories. And they have a way of connecting with memories of places and people. And one thing that struck me in Regensburg, of course, was some of the plaques commemorating some things that happened, specifically the bombings that took place in the city during the Second World War. And these plaques actually have the numbers of people killed. And at one church, actually, they have a list of the names, right? So apparently, the victims are named, they are counted, and they're part of the memory of the city. So landscapes actually can tell us more about the history and the memories. But that got me thinking, because as a historian, I'm a historian of a different form of violence. The violence that is not for physical, the violence that cannot be quantified. So I got thinking, like, how then do you deal with narratives that commemorate the forgetting of history? Narratives that actually erase people from historical memory, and how do you historically document the violence that cannot be immediately measured or quantified, and that is whose effects actually have a long latency period. So those are the kind of fundamental questions that I pursue in my research, because I'm looking at a different form of violence, and this violence actually cannot be measured and quantified more objectively in the context of time. So my paper is part of my broader and long-term research that looks at the chemical violence, what I call the chemical violence of colonial encounters in Africa, focusing on the toxic legacies, and of course, wanting to look at what I call the new narratives of the toxic epidemic. What I look at here, of course, is I want to investigate not only the invisibilized encounters, but also the scale and magnitude of this slow violence, and trace it temporally and spatially in a way that connects the past and present as a core component of post-colonial African scholarship to investigate the toxic legacies of these encounters and expand on the parameters to see how it was administered across time. And Laura Stoll actually says something about this form of violence. She says that while the violent crimes of the colonial past have been named, the corrosions of the less visible elements of soil and soil have not. So the slow violence have not been quantified and investigated. So part of my research project actually aims to investigate this and understand not only the violence, but also its intersection with colonialism, technoscience, race, and of course how chemical pollution distributes exposure and mortality in a very disproportionate way, or in the context of power relations, because power relations matter in how we configure contamination and toxicity, because toxicity is not a given. It is not given in advance, but it is stimulated by power structures, social epistemes, historical structures, and infrastructures. So that is basically the concept of my research. So the toxic epidemic that I make reference to is colonial and historical, but it manifests in contemporary landscapes and communities in Africa. What you're seeing here, of course, is one of the problems that is confronts South Africa, and that is the problem of toxic mining pollution. and at the current moment, toxic waste from South African historical gold mines have emerged as the largest single source of waste pollution in the country. So that's just to show you how past colonial encounters actually have some manifestations in present landscapes. And this is a very interesting case study in Zambia, in Kabwe. It used to be a mining town. And after the Anglo-American Corporation actually abandoned the mine, they left behind legacies of lead poisoning that actually affected thousands and thousands of children, brain damage and a lot of medical conditions actually. And that led to a lawsuit that was filed in the South African High Court against Anglo-American Corporation. They lost the case, but on the basis of some technicalities that I've actually described in this paper. But the most important thing, of course, to understand that the toxic legacies which are there have been acknowledged, and the United Nations actually describes Kabwe as one of the world's most polluted places on Earth. So I'm just trying to establish a context that tries to show that colonial encounters have post-colonial results in terms of the toxic legacies. And there is a need for historians to be able to make this connection. And when I was looking at the literature, much of the research has been done by social scientists, and they focus on the contemporary practices. So what I'm trying to do in my research, of course, is to go to the archive and make the connection between contemporary practices and the whole history of extractivism and racial capitalism in Africa. So let me go to the argument that I make. So in this paper, I propose the concept of an African Wasteocene as an analytical mode to discuss the unique encounters and relations between African bodies, racial capitalism, and toxic waste during the colonial period. I argue that this was a form of violence, but the concrete experiences of such encounters have largely been eviscerated from historical memory through systematic narrative violence. I also posit that extractive sites in Africa were scenes of silent and silenced genocide. That is one of the major hypotheses that I make. From looking at the research that has been done before, people actually emphasize on ecocide. And I want to extend the parameters of the conceptual framework and actually argue that we are looking at silenced genocides. If you look at the encounters that happened in the extractive sites, and if you dig deeper at the fragments of the Wasteocenic encounters, you actually see masses and masses of human bodies buried within the chemical infrastructure of racial capitalism. But my conceptualization of what I call the African Wasteocene, I have to emphasize that I'm not trying to argue that this is a unique encounter or essentialize the African experience as distinct maybe from, let's say, for example, from the Asian or European Wasteocene. Right? I'm not trying to say that there are differences. I'm trying to use the concept as it is applied in Gabriel Hecht. Actually, Gabriel Hecht proposes the notion of interscalar vehicles. That is, objects and methods of analysis that position time and deep time and human time simultaneously, geological scales and human and political scales at the same time. So whilst I'm looking at the African Wasteocene, I'm pinning it to the planetary Wasteocene, so that at least I'm kind of telling a different story of the Wasteocene without simply saying that this is a unique encounter. So I do not want to fall into the conceptual trap of actually trying to argue and say that this is a unique moment. So this is just an attempt to place a planet and a place on the planet and create an analytical framework. This takes me to the whole, I think, the core analytical framework that actually informs my discussion. which is the Wasteocene. The Wasteocene being from the seminal work by Marco Amiero. And in it, of course, Marco Amiero highlights the main thing that West is the main thing of our epoch. Like West is the apotheosis of the Anthropocene. But West it's not just physical West, but also West as a set of relationships producing Western human beings and places. And he sees that as embedding the stratigraphy of power and toxicity, which are projected through a set of sociological relationships underlined by the practices of othering, like looking at people within hierarchies of us and them. So what the Wasteocene does, I think, which is very much the main focus, is that it rejects this whole concept of the Anthropocene as the universalistic framing of humans as we. So it's another alternative way of looking at the Anthropocene that tries to apportion responsibility to a specific group of people. Maybe you can think of it as the idea of the capitalocene in a way, but framed within the context of toxic West. So the Wasteocene is not just about West, but it's about relationships and also catalogs and forms of knowledge and regimes of narrating things that have a narrative identity, which is scripted to normalize, invisibilize, misinform on the violations of subaltern bodies or non-white bodies, so that we do not see the injustices of racial capitalism. So the infrastructure of the narrative infrastructure that actually conceals that is what is called what are called toxic narratives. And Stefania Barker has a very much a neat way of packaging it. That is, narratives may not kill people. They did not actually kill people, but what they do is they conceal the killing that is happening and the victims of the killing from view, so that we do not see them, and then convincing us that they're not part of modernity and history. And this is done through a number of processes. The first one being concealing and making the injustices disappear from collective memory, which is invisibilization, or naturalizing and normalizing the injustice, dismissing alternative forms of knowledge or experiences, and blaming the victims. And this is not really a new practice. Even industries actually do the same kind of processes. Now let me go to the background, which is how arsenic came to be very much a big factor in global gold mining. So in the 1870s, we have a boom in gold production, which actually subsides at the end of the 19th century as a result of the alluvial ores running out. And what this means is that there were supposed to be new methods of extracting gold ores, new technologies, because the gold ores were actually now much available underground. So one of the methods that was discovered to extract gold was roasting, and this was discovered in Australia. And it changed much of the fortunes of gold mining at a time when much of mining capital was in disarray. I'm trying to illustrate here the gold roasting technology. That is an arsenopyritic ore, sometimes referred to as fool's gold. And roasting it was a process of oxidizing or heating the arsenopyritic ore, and then the byproducts were iron oxides, sulfur dioxide, and arsenic trioxide. Arsenic trioxide was released as a gas from the roasting plant, and then at cooler temperatures it would condense into a white toxic powder that would be cascaded across the landscape in huge amounts. It actually was a problem with most mines from the history of in colonial Australia, Canada. There was a problem of how to regulate and manage this toxic arsenic dust, because it was released in very huge quantities. So whilst this was happening, the whole story of the colonization of Zimbabwe is actually also tied to the gold mining capital, because that man over there, Sisi John Rhodes, formed the BSAC company that was responsible for the colonization of Zimbabwe in 1889. And his imperial dream was the hope of finding gold in the colony, because gold had been discovered in South Africa, and he thought that the rands spread downward further north. So his colonial venture was actually financed by gold mining capital. But what happened is that by the end of the 19th century, that gold was not available, and they only had low-grade ores, which led to the reconstitution of the mining industry and the coming in of these new technologies that have been developed in Australia and in the colonies, such as roasting and cyanidation from around 1900. So the whole idea here I'm trying to emphasize is that the history of gold mining, there are global connections in terms of how the technology spread, in terms of the problems that were encountered, and the kind of solutions that were proffered. And so we have a whole infrastructure of Wasteocene, if you're looking at the global gold industry during the colonial period. So from the 1910s, when this technology is introduced in southern Rhodesia, I'm looking at the archives and trying to see, do we have the problems that we find in the other colonies? And it was only until I arrived at 1914 that I realized that there was the first commission of inquiry into arsenic poisoning from gold mines, which was set up by the colonial government. And this commission was set up because there was trouble of cattle getting poisoned by arsenic, allegedly, of course, according to the mining officials. And so there was a commission which was set up. They took soil samples, they took grass samples, and tested them for arsenic. And then there was another commission of inquiry in 1925, 1927, also because of cattle poisoning. 1935 to 1937, I'll go into detail on these commissions, but I'm just trying to establish a timeline of the responses of the colonial government to the arsenic fallout that was happening within gold mining landscapes. 1935-1937, there was what was called the Umtali Cattle Commissions. A number of farms, I think about 5 or 6 farms, complained about the death of cattle in large numbers. That was happening within the farms. And the commission was set up. But most importantly, the commission that I'm very much interested in, because it clearly articulates the racial dimension of exposure that I pursue in this paper, is the 1961 Kemen Motor Mine inquiry. This inquiry came after some sicknesses, unaccounted sicknesses, befell a white suburb within the environments of the Kemen Motor Mine gold, the Kemen Motor Mine gold mine. And what is interesting is the narratives that actually were created by the colonial officials, the branch of chemistry, the government analysts, to try and explain what was happening. But I'll come to that. This is just show you the files of the commissions of inquiry reports that I did. Now, for a study of this nature, it would be inadequate not to know, quantify in terms of how much pollution was happening, how much toxic contamination was happening. So one of the things I sought to do was to quantify the arsenic fallout that was happening within these gold mining landscapes. And I came across one source that gave me an idea or an indication. I had to dig very deep. And from the figures that I got, one specific gold mine called the Kemen Motor Mine, they crushed 10,031 tons of ore per month. And what this released in terms of waste was 90 tons of arsenic trioxide waste. So on average, I just did the math, we're talking of 1,080 tons of toxic arsenic waste annually. And I looked at the company records, the history of the company. This mine operated from 1912 until it was closed in 1968. So that's about 68 years. And if you multiply all that, you come to roughly 71,280 tons of toxic arsenic. This is just one mine. So you can actually look at the grand scale of the fallout from that basic mathematical calculation. Now, this is the most exciting part of my research. I wanted now to understand in what ways, of course, are human beings exposed to this arsenic from the roasting plants. And I came across one specific colonial source that was describing what happened within the roasting plant. And what caught my attention was the ways in which it actually positions kind of there are racially prescribed roles in the roasting plants. The natives who did this work was supposed to be done by natives. And also the hazards that were actually also involved in terms of the dangerous nature of the work. But most importantly, what actually caught my attention was how the narrative is looking at why people get poisoned in the roasting plant, and it blames that on the defective bodies of the natives. And actually, the report says as long as the person does not perspire, the arsenic does not enter the system. So as long as you're working within this hot environment, and doing all that work, as long as you do not sweat. So a non-perspiring native body is posited as the body to be gazed upon. A body that perspires is a defective body that must be thrown away. So these are some of the constructions that I look at, and I get a kind of feeling that we're talking of scenes of immense chemical violence, not just regular industrial workspaces here. And in actual fact, in one of the minutes of the mining engineers, they reveal that there has been some cases of an increase in the cases of poisoning in the mines, and they are proposing for some kind of new safety measures. They do not say how many have been killed, but they say, well, we've lost a lot of people, so we actually need to improve the system. Just perhaps a brief rundown of some of the conceptual, some of the concepts that I use in this paper. I look at racial capitalism, which of course is very much used by scholars looking at race and toxic waste, and specifically how they emphasize on how racism fueled capitalism from the very beginning, and have worked to give it form and strength. Cedric Robinson, in particular, of course, dismissing the whole class, I think, based component of Marxist exploration of capitalism in Europe. It arguing, of course, that the first European proletariats were Jews, gypsies, and other racial minorities. So I try as much as possible to locate this colonial encounter within racial capitalism, and I argue that capitalism is racial, and I think in the context of colonial Africa, an attempt to bring in class dilutes the concrete experiences of and encounters of native bodies with racial capitalism. But I think I'll go there at the very end. Now, to make this very clear, and to show, of course, how palpable colonial narratives were framed differently with respect to race within this context, or within this space of arsenic, within the context of the gold roasting plants. This is the incident that happened in 1961 of the Armstrong family. And perhaps I might read portions of it, because this is a report by the medical director. In the report, he says their home, which is 2 miles or so from the roasting plant. So this is 2 miles, and these natives are within the roasting plant, and they don't cause concern. Their home, which is like 2 miles from the roasting plant, is spotless. Moreover, their close neighbors show only relatively small amounts of arsenic in their hair, and I'm satisfied that the poisoning occurs while they're at the garage, which is situated in the area of maximum fallout from the chimney. Miss and Miss Armstrong spend most of their time in the office spares store, into which the African employees are not permitted to go. this is very important because this particular sentence is added so that the narrative shifts the gaze away from them. Right. So Miss and Miss Armstrong spend most of their time in that office. The spares are arranged in the usual manner. That's not important. And then the child Charles, who has a strong mechanical bent and spends most of his time playing in the garage, has had repeated attacks of pneumonia, and investigations have revealed pathological changes in the lungs. Blah, 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 blah. The Armstrong family are, so far as I know, the only persons who have been severely affected by the arsenic. And also, so far as I know, the only ones whose lives were in any danger. They've been given suitable advice and intend to leave the district as soon as possible. Right. So, I think what is pretty much clear here is, despite the fact that the Armstrong family are very much far away from chemical exposure, 2 miles away, they actually are given much care within this narrative. And the African bodies within the same environs, of course, are displaced from the narrative because they don't go into this specific office, but that's the same house. So this is some of the narratives that I look at closely when I read the Colonial Archive, and I try to see, okay, so these people are displaced, but what was their condition? Their miseries are not put into context. This is a report by the mining inspector, and in it he emphasizes that there is no evidence to show that any employee, European or native, are suffering from symptoms of arsenic poisoning. But then he goes on that to mention that there was the deposition of sublime arsenic in the buildings in and around the compound. That is where the African workers stayed. So, I mean, basically from a scientific point of view, the deposition of any toxic substance within the residential quarters of human beings is a hazard. But within these narratives, the displacement of certain bodies and certain other bodies are given much more primacy. The othering that underlies the Wasteocene project. So outside the direct contact with arsenic within the toxic workspaces, I noticed that African bodies were also chemically compromised through the contamination of the food and the water that they drank. A number of tests were conducted. I'm using these reports that I made reference to earlier. After this commission of inquiry came into play, they conducted some experiments, and they took samples of water, of food, and tested them for arsenic. The test showed the presence of high, it's not so visible there, quantity of arsenic for maize, 22 parts per million. I think it's on the other side there. And what was very much important was that the figures that were shown in the maize, the beans, were sometimes as high as 374 times the standards that were set up by the British in 1900. So this is happening within the context where the British government has a standard of how much arsenic must be in the food. And then when the colonial government takes these samples and they test the samples for the presence of arsenic and find out that they contain very unusually high amounts of arsenic, they come up with narratives that are very ambiguous and ambivalent in terms of trying to determine whether it is safe for people to eat or to drink that water. And this is an interesting conclusion that was drawn up by one of the government analysts after being asked about his opinion on the food samples that were taken. And what you can just see here is that there is no definite concrete position on whether this is safe. We presume naturally that all vegetables and green meals are washed before cooking and eating. If the amount of arsenic is toxic, if you wash them well, it's safe. I mean, there's that doubtful placement of science, which makes it difficult to understand what is happening. One of the things that I look at is how colonial medicine constructed arsenic toxicities on African bodies. Because from the 1950s, the government analysts and other medical officers at the mines took samples of African hair to test them for the presence of arsenic. This still is one of the ways of ascertaining chronic poisoning, arsenic or poisoning, because arsenic binds itself with the keratin, which is found in the human hair and the nails. So the presence of arsenic within certain values basically means that someone has been exposed to a point where there's a risk of chronic poisoning. This is just an example of one of the notes that was generated by the government analyst after taking a sample of hair and showing that there were 190 parts per million of arsenic, which is very much over the limit that is acceptable if under safe standards. And that apparently is a very interesting aspect of what was happening within this gold mining landscape. So after the 1961 Commission of Inquiry was sent out, one of the things that they did was to expose animals to the foliage within the arsenic fallout area. So a guinea pig was actually given that herbage, and it ate that herbage from the roasting plant, and it died, which meant that obviously it was very toxic. And after that, they tested the animal body parts for how much arsenic is there, trying to determine if an animal eats arsenic, how much of it is detectable within within its system. So the conclusion that was drawn by the government analyst after high amounts of African hair tested for arsenic was that, of course, there were cases where some Africans were sick, but according to him, they did not show any particularly alarming symptoms and seemed to be in reasonably good health. And he goes on and says some had a few complaints indicating peripheral neuritis, that's a nervous condition, nervous system condition caused by, in some cases, exposure to toxics, aches and pains, but not many. It is apparent, therefore, that the situation at Gatoma is not as serious as might be thought from the high values found for arsenic in the human hair. Though this does not minimize the dangers of oral ingestion from contaminated vegetables. Now, this is very interesting. The previous narrative actually dismissed the presence of arsenic in vegetables as a danger. But now that, in actual fact, the arsenic is in the hair, it is convenient, of course, to revert back to that narrative. But most importantly, what the government analyst does highlight is the fact that the arsenic is not on the hair and not absorbed into the body. And there's a huge distinction between exogenous and endogenous arsenic. This narrative was one that was used very much strongly by the government analyst and the medical director in trying to explain why is it that Africans working in the roasting plant who actually have these symptoms of neuritis have high readings of arsenic in their hair. So the argument was that, well, I mean, the arsenic is not in the system. It's just in the hair. It's outside. So we can't really say that there's any danger that is happening there. And even after they washed the hair with T-Pol, and there was still a high reading, they actually emphasized that under these circumstances, it's very difficult to remove the arsenic from the hair. So apparently we're talking of endogenous arsenic here, not, exogenous arsenic here, and not arsenic that is within the blood. And that is what is interesting is when the same readings were found on the hair of the Armstrong family, there was an emergency response by the colonial officials, and they gave an interpretation that was different. And this is where I think certain scholars in the field of environment, technology, and medicine have come up with this concept of colonial science as a distinct form of science. Like colonial science is another country; they do things differently. From colonial science and the metropole science, it's a huge contestation because other scholars like Macleod, for instance, dismisses such conceptions and says these are attempts at creating new disciplines and within the field. But in actual fact, there was a unitary standard that was used in the colonies. So colonial science here, of course, being used as one of the tools of trying to create narratives. And these narratives are what, when you look at the archive not so closely, you do not see these encounters. Because when I went to the archive, I was trying to look for, because if you're going to make an argument about a genocide, you must have bodies to legitimate your claim. And without bodies, of course, then there's no genocide. So there were no bodies in the colonial archive. I couldn't really concretely quantify bodies that I could use and say these are the bodies of the victims of chemical violence. And I felt, well, I had reached a dead end. But then I thought, like, there could be ways of actually interrogating the colonial archive. And you can actually show, not by virtue of bodies per se, but by virtue of showing the extensive nature of chemical exposure and the precincts within which it happened. And I think it could be a valid way of going forward. But I'll leave that maybe for discussion. Right. So one of the things, of course, that I realized is that there are some fragments, small broken pieces, that we can be used to tell the story of the African Wasteocene. And these fragments are they're not the official narratives. These are the minority narratives, which you just find lying there. But if you put them together, they actually create a very interesting story. And one of them is a study that I found, which was done by Osborne. Osborne was a government medical officer, surprisingly, but he did an independent study between 1953 and 1967. He was looking at the prevalence of carcinoma bronchus, which is cancer of the lung. And what he found was that there was a high prevalence of that amongst African patients in some hospitals. What was most striking was that almost all of them, in one case, he had 37, a cohort of 37 patients, 36 of them had a gold mining history. And it struck him as not just a coincidence. And not only that, most of the 36 had keratosis or symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning. So he concluded that because these people have a gold mining history, the reason why they have these high incidences of cancer is because of exposure to arsenic. But what was much more interesting was a study that he did in one of the patients, who is called patient Misiano. He was called Misiano. Misiano had worked at a gold mine in Banget, a certain area called Banget, from 1933. That's when he started working. Then 2 years later, he developed symptoms of keratosis. That's keratosis shown on the hands, the hardening of the palms and feet because of arsenic exposure. So 2 years later, he had keratosis. And then, of course, he went on working until 1956. That's about 23 years later. And this just shows the staggered nature of chemical violence. 23 years later, he became sick, complained of pains at the back of his um, at the back part, at his back, and then he actually succumbed to death and died in October 1956. So if you follow that storyline, you get to see the kind of violence, how it is manifesting, and why it is difficult to be able to quantify the victims. There's geographic displacement, there's displacement that is happening across time, and all that. So that is one of the fragments that I use. The other fragment that I use is eco-criticism. This is a novel, White Jacarandas, by Diana Polisensky. She now lives in the US, but interestingly, Diana Polisensky was born in Zimbabwe, Colonial Zimbabwe, to a medical family. Her father was a mine medical officer. So she grew up on a mine in Kwekwe, where there was one of the roasting plants. And in this book, she narrates some of the chronicles of the things that are most likely were the experiences at the mine. And there, from the book, Where Was Jacarandas, some of the medical problems of people within the community, that a certain number that developed a certain number of medical conditions, such as Cushing's disease, and of course the amount of arsenic in the air, and the whole atmosphere of chemical death that enveloped this town. And this one struck me because it gives a physical location of the compound within the context of the mine, and the location, of course, of the European residences, and how the compound was very much in the path of much of the chemical exposure that was happening. And of course, again, this idea of trying to show the amount of chemicals that was around the mine and the dangers it posed to the workers in their health. So this is just one of the many fragments that I pick up and try to piece together to create my story of the Wasteocene within the context of genocide. Now, this brings me to the conclusion. Anti-colonial narratives of the Wasteocene in African history. I go back to the question that I'm trying to frame here is, what does the Wasteocene look like when gauged from the point of view of African history? At a specific moment, what does it look like? And I come up with the fact that the first thing is that the Wasteocene in Africa, of course, was based on the philosophy of racial Darwinism and the expendability of African bodies and native bodies, and their animalization as non-humans in settler discourses of power and hegemony. And not only that, but these constructions were actually propped up by knowledge systems and narrative processes that expunged the traces of these chemical genocides from view. And these were perpetrated within the centers of capitalist production, such as farms, mines, factories, and industries. Much of my research material looks at the use of pesticides even in the farms and the locust destruction campaigns. So when I'm making this case, I'm not only looking at it from the point of mining, but I'm looking at the extensive nature of the use of chemicals and how native bodies were disposable within those arenas. So I posit that despite that, we can reconstruct this Wasteocene, which is maybe lost through new regimes of knowledge that makes visible the racial violence of capitalism. The first thing that I propose is a a category of analysis that privileges race and not class as an exclusive focus of analysis. I argue that in the context of Africa, where racial segregation was enforced and administratively formalized and sanctioned, class analysis is a domesticated narrative that trivializes and dilutes the concrete historical experiences of wasting away. But by reifying and essentializing race in my exploration of the African Wasteocene, I'm not trying to maybe obfuscate the utility of class relations within the Wasteocene. But what I'm trying to do is to illuminate on how class under conditions of settler colonialism does not represent a useful and objective vantage point from which we can understand the nature and scale of racialized violence. So one of the things that I really thought could be a problem was, how is class a thing in this? And I feel class is not a thing under conditions of settler colonialism in Africa, because the race was actually the prominent way of othering, and class distinctions really do not give us a much broader picture of what was happening. Secondly, I call for new methodologies of reading and transcribing the colonial archive to pierce through the fragmented experiences and review the disproportionate nature of chemical violence. And there are many ways in which I propose this. One of which, of course, is trying to use other bodies as mirrors through which we can see the experiences of the bodies which are not there, or the invisible bodies. I take the concept of chemical relations or the concept of relations. I think Linda Nash, Inescapable Ecologies, is a starting point of trying to understand and imagine the fact that our bodies and landscapes are interconnected. So if there's a chemical exposure through one body, then it compromises the whole multi-species in that regard. I also call for vicarious imagination, or using our imagination to reconstruct some of these historical realities. And then lastly, which is a component of my future, I think, research projection, which is interdisciplinary research on the toxic legacies on present landscapes and communities to evaluate the kind of vulnerabilities which are there, and while doing so, engaging new frameworks of environmental justice research, because environmental justice research has actually grown and become much more radical and proactive, where they've moved from just looking at environmental injustice as just discrimination and inequalities, but as a form of violence that is even has, that is effects of trauma and affects people in much more extensive ways. So as part of that project, the whole idea is to create a whole new anti-colonial narrative that would generate a new data that can be able to contest the hegemonic logic of the Wasteocene, as Marco Amiero says. And here, Gabriel Hecht, of course, emphasizing the need for asking new and different questions, which would be very useful to connect exposure and health and counter what she calls residual governance. Now, interestingly, I just want to give this a global context, because at the beginning I spoke about Canada. Okay, as one of the areas where arsenic was a problem. A historical project was able to come up with multidisciplinary array of researchers into this area, which is the area of the Dene people, these are indigenous communities, and to try and kind of a clean-up process. But you can see, of course, 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide were collected. So we're speaking of a similar kind of thing. But in the case of colonial Zimbabwe, nothing has been done. Just as a parting shot, arsenic is a non-degradable. So those thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of arsenic dumped in the environment, can we just assume that they went away? And they're in areas where people actually live. So whilst extractive sites are just, we can see them as places where people extract, but for communities, these are areas for livelihoods. That's where their homes are. So this is where I want to connect the past and the present. Thank you.